we're starting to have a collapse. From 1999 to 2011, competition from China cost the United States more than 2 million factory jobs, according to academic research. In the midst of that, flaws in the United States financial system set off a global economic crisis. In 2008 and 2009, Mr. Biden took the reins of the second most powerful office in the United States. The major GM and Chrysler plants in his state shuttered. Do you see a trend here, folks? Where Biden goes, economy crashes. The United States is left on the wayside. And this man cannot be president. At the end of his first term, President Barack Obama rolled out an ambitious shift in the U.S. foreign policy, moving diplomatic and military resources from the Middle East to Asia, mainly to address the challenge of China. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton called it a pivot, and Mr. Obama said, "The United States is a Pacific power, and we are here to stay." He puts Marines in Australia and tried forging a trade pact among 12 Pacific Rim nations that was implicitly aimed at countering China. Mr. Biden met with Mr. Xi at least 8 times in 2011 and 2012 to gauge China's incoming leader, even playing basketball with him at a high school. Now, Mr. Campbell, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, who helped organize the trips, called that Mr. Biden had ended up judging Mr. Xi as tough and unsentimental, someone who questioned American power and believed in the superiority of the Communist Party. White House meeting, he said Biden told advisors, "I think we got our hands full of this guy." I'm going to say that again. Mr. Campbell, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, who helped organize these trips, recalled that Mr. Biden had ended up judging Mr. Xi, as tough and unsentimental, someone who questioned American power and believed in the superiority of the Communist Party. In a White House meeting, he said Mr. Biden told advisors, "I think we got our hands full with this guy." Mr. Xi and other Chinese officials saw the pivot as Cold War style containment. And in 2013, they started bolstering territorial and maritime claims in the East China Sea and South China Sea, which the U.S. military dominates. Mr. Biden supported the administration's decision to fly U.S. bombers and sail warships through the zones, and he told Mr. Xi of Washington's growing anger. The old relationship was fading. I want to make it clear that as long as they play by a set of basic international rules that were written, that he did not like the fact he didn't write them. They didn't write them. See how this is written? I want to make it clear that as long as they played by a set of basic international rules that were written, and he did not like the fact he didn't write them. They didn't write them. We'd have no problem, Mr. Biden said in his interview with the Times. But to the extent that they tried to fundamentally alter the rules of airspace and sea space, what constitutes freedom of navigation, etc., then we'd have a problem. Hours before Mr. Biden gave his Democratic nomination acceptance speech in August on a stage in Wilmington, Delaware, he received an unexpected boost. 75 Republican national security specialists, some of who had worked for Mr. Trump, released a letter endorsing Mr. Biden. They asserted that Mr. Trump lacks the character and competence to lead the nation and has engaged in corrupt behavior. The writers mentioned 2 episodes from Trump's relationship with Mr. Xi when he called on the Chinese leader last year to start an investigation into Mr. Biden, and when he praised Mr. Xi as a brilliant leader, an example of Mr. Trump's cozying up to the dictators, the letter echoed recent devastating accounts, including from John R. Bolton, the former national security advisor, who called Mr. Trump's approach to China haphazard and based on self-interest rather than national interest. That message dovetailed with Mr. Biden's, that Mr. Trump's supposed toughness on China was a mirage. But Biden's campaign has hammered the president over his response to the coronavirus, even running advertisements reminding voters that Mr. Trump praised Mr. Xi's handling of the pandemic. And Mr. Biden has said that Mr. Trump's trade deal with China is failing. Mr. Biden's attempts to out-hawk Mr. Trump have prompted some blowback. Some Asian Americans have criticized his anti-China advertisements as racist. And progressive critics of American power say Biden's is perpetuating misguided ideas of U.S. superiority. But Mr. Biden is under political pressure to look tough. A new poll conducted by Pew Research Center found that 73% of Americans had unfavorable view of China, the highest in at least 15 years. More than half see China as a competitor. With his trade proposals, Mr. Biden has tried to bridge the views between Democratic Party's center and his left wing, led by Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. That has sometimes resulted in ambiguity. Mr. Biden has not committed to removing Mr. Trump's tariffs on China. His aides say he would first review how they affect the American middle class. Mr. Biden has also held back from promising to have the United States enter the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, despite Mr. Obama's efforts, failed to gain enough support among Americans, partly because of opposition from labor unions and progressive Democratic politicians. Japan helped finalize that agreement. Some of Biden's ideas echo those of Trump officials, including incentives to move more important corporate supply chains out of China. He envisions using the federal government's purchasing power through Buy American plans to bolster manufacturing of critical goods like pharmaceuticals at home. But while Mr. Trump and Sanders call for pushing China, Mr. Biden's aides emphasize a restoration of U.S. domestic strength. Biden's aides emphasize the restoration of U.S. domestic strength. Speaking in June at Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, Jack Sullivan, one of Biden's top advisors, said the United States should put less focus on trying to slow China down and more emphasis on trying to run faster ourselves. Aides say that includes making investments in scientific research and emerging U.S. industries, as well as restoring alliances abroad. On human rights, Mr. Biden insists China must pay a price. A campaign spokesman said in August that Biden believed the Chinese government was committing genocide against ethnic Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang region. Mr. Biden says he will impose sanctions and commercial restrictions on Chinese officials and entities responsible for repression. While the Trump administration has recently sanctioned companies, the individuals involved in Xinjiang, Mr. Trump has previously encouraged Mr. Xi to keep building internet camps there, Mr. Bolton wrote, and to handle pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong in his own way. Mr. Biden plans to try to win China's cooperation on issues like climate change. In Iran, and North Korea. But that could be a challenge if Trump's administration hawks succeed in hard-wiring hostility in the relationship. And regardless, every interaction with China, Mr. Campbell said, was a negotiation in which Chinese officials tried to find a source of leverage, even when it's something that is in their mutual interests, like climate change. In the past years, China lost benefits of doubt among Mr. Campbell and other key Biden advisors, all Obama administration veterans who are likely to hold important government posts if Biden wins. Members of Biden's inner circle agree on the need to confront China on bad behavior. Susan Rice and Samantha Power, often mentioned as potential candidates for Secretary of State, denounced Beijing's atrocities on ethnic Uyghurs and repression in Hong Kong. So they go on to say they'll use carrots and sticks and pressure, carrots and their microphones and pressure to reassurance to negotiate with the Chinese side. And State Department official under President Bill Clinton says, I don't think they'll shy away from imposing costs. One thing is clear. If Mr. Biden becomes president, his 40-year-old association with China will reach a crescendo. Analysts on both sides of the Pacific say greater conflict will be inevitable, given the two nations' ideological systems, nationalist sentiments, and trajectories. One, a superpower of the ascent, and the other trying to preserve its reach. Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, said his nation rejected a new Cold War, but he emphasized that the United States must abandon its fantasy of remodeling China to U.S. needs. So, this goes back to Biden. China, they're not gonna be proper and prime. And Biden is messing with fire, and it's messing with our country. There's a question I've been meaning to ask students of China, Biden said. The students of Tiananmen Square, were they patriots or traitors to the People's Republic of China? There was a silence. Then a physics student, a scholar of Newton and Einstein, stood up. The students of Tiananmen were heroes of the People's Republic of China, he said. Senator, change will come to China, but it will be we, the students of Newton, who determine the peace and the direction of that change, and not you or anyone else working on the banks of the Potomac. So there you go, folks. We've gotten ourselves in some hot water, and students of the People's Republic of China, heroes, said to Biden, I'm going to read it again, Senator, change will come to China, but it will be we, the students of Newton, who determine the pace and the direction of that change, and not you or anyone else working on the banks of the Potomac. And it takes students of the Tiananmen, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, to give some reality to Biden. So we have someone who made a relationship with Communist China, brought them into the World Trade Organization, and the people who were against this in the vote stressed human rights and the proliferation. And I gotta tell you, we can't be messing with these devils, these communists. And we can't have people representing our country like Biden and the Democrats standing behind him who are getting bankrolled or are being threatened to go along with an agenda to take down our country because they've made a deal with the devil. So I hope this was somewhat clear, and I'll see you guys on the next video. And remember, guys, we don't want to have our police taken away and have the communist China have Antifa, a form of Antifa, attacking people when the communists don't get their way. Their agenda isn't going the way they want, and the American people are rebelling against the abuse, because that's what's going to happen. We're going to be a third world country. Professionals have already come out and said this. We're going to be a communist country, and a country we will be no more. All right, guys, take care of each other. Trump 2020, and I'll see you on the next video.